In this video, I'll show you how we can start with the default Flutter application and from there make our own applications using test-driven development. What I already have for us here is the default Flutter project and the web version running in the browser. Now the first thing we're going to need is to update some of our dependencies, and that's always done through the pubspec.yaml file. Alright, let's scroll down a bit. We can see that these are the dependencies that will be included in the application, but what we're interested in are the dependencies that are used in the development environment. So that's the dev dependencies section. The Flutter test framework is in there by default, but we want to also add Dart's default testing framework. So the easiest way to do that is to just say test and any here. Save that file and go ahead and run pub-get. You'll see down here the Flutter console opens, and it shouldn't take very long to run that. Okay, that's one of the pieces we need in order to do test-driven development outside of the Flutter framework. Alright, let's look in the project structure in the test folder. By default, there's a widget test here, but what we want is a new unit test, so let's go ahead and make a new file here. I'm going to right-click and say New Dart file, and I'm going to call this greeter test. You can put a .dart here if you want to, but you don't need to. The framework will put that in place for us. Also, it recognizes that there was a change in the pubspec, but we already hit pub-get on that other screen. For some reason, the IDE doesn't quite notice that. We can just ignore this now. Okay, let's start by writing a simple test case. Now, of course, this test function comes from the testing framework, and if I use Alt-Enter here, it will prompt me to import this test package which we added to pubspec. Perfect. Now that Alt-Enter keystroke is fabulous in all these JetBrains IDEs, and I'll be using that a lot during this tutorial. Okay, so what is my test going to be? That the greeter says hello. Okay, well, what's a greeter? Well, we're going to make a thing called a greeter, like this, and we're going to have the greeter give us a greeting like this. Now we shouldn't be worried about the fact that this doesn't compile, because of course it doesn't compile. There's no greeter created yet. We're using test-driven development, which means before we write our production code, we write a test that gives us a specification for how it should behave. Let's get our assertion in place here, like this. We expect our greeting to be hello. Okay, now we can create the actual greeter by going to the lib folder, right-click, make another new Dart file, and I'll call this greeter. And here I can make a class called greeter. Now I've saved that file. I can go back over to my test now, and where the greeter is referenced, if I use that old Alt-Enter trick, one of my options here will be to import my production code from greeter.dart, and that's what I want. So now my test code is connected to my production code, but of course I still don't have this method. What I can do again is use Alt-Enter, you guessed it, to create that method. Now if I prefer, of course I could come over here and just type it in, but using the auto generation is convenient. Notice that by default this method is a dynamic method. Its return type is not specified, it's dynamic. But in fact we know that what it's going to return is a string, so I like to put that in there. Okay. Now, let's write the simplest possible code to make our test pass, and that will be to return the string hello. Okay, let's go ahead and run our test. I'll right-click on the test and say run greeter test. We can see that the test passed, that's the name of the test, and that all of our tests passed, well, because that's the only one we ran. So that's all we need to test our model code. But for our next step, let's see how we can use that model from within a Flutter frontend. Now the first thing I'm going to do when I open up that Flutter code is tear out all of this existing stuff we see over here. So that's very quickly going to make it so that widget test is not useful at all. Let's go ahead and delete that. Okay, over in main.dart, we scroll down a little bit, we can see that there's this thing called my home page, which is being plugged into my app. And this is where I like to just take this whole definition and everything beneath it and eliminate it. Now, of course, this doesn't compile, so we can't update our running code just yet. Let's make something called a greeter app. And this can be a stateless widget. Now, whether you need a stateful widget or a stateless widget here is outside of the scope of this video. Suffice it to say for now that a stateless widget is all I need here. Once again, the Flutter framework is letting me know that there's something I need to change here with that red squiggly, and it tells me I'm missing a concrete implementation. Now, of course, what I usually do is just click there and press Alt-Enter and generate the missing override. Again, you could type it if you wanted to, but you may as well use the tool to automate such things. Okay, so let's just make this the simplest possible implementation here. We can make a greeter like we did in the test. And when we build our user interface, let's just take a text widget and make its text be whatever the greeter is when it says hello. Now this can't find the greeter class, but once again, it's just a matter of getting our imports in place. So there we go. Oops, and I just have a typo here. That should be say hello. Great. Now to get this widget showing over here, I just need to replace this my homepage with greeter app. All right, save the file and it automatically rebuilds, and there it is. We see it right here in the web. So that's pretty nice. Let's look at the compiler warning here. This is letting me know that there should be a default constructor here. I'm going to go ahead and generate that. You can click on it here, or of course, use Alt-Enter. There's another warning up here that we should address, and this has to do with the fact that this can be const, and so the Flutter style guide says it should be const. Let's go ahead and do that. Great. Save the file. Nothing over here changes because that was just increasing the quality of the code here. Okay, so that's enough to get you started, but depending on what widgets you want to use in your application, you may run into another kind of problem. So I'll show you what that looks like here. Let's say that after this text we wanted a text field where we could type in our own message. Well, let's go back over here and wrap this text widget inside of a column. Once again, the IDE makes this really easy. I can use Alt-Enter and wrap with column. Perfect, so convenient. Okay, after the text, we'll put in a text field. Now there's a warning here because that also can be const since it has no other state. There we are. And when I hit Control S, we might expect a text field to show up on the right, but instead we get this rather awful error message. It's telling us that we can't use the text field because it's not part of a whole material application. What's missing is a piece called the scaffold. And when I'm building my own Flutter projects, I usually make that right up here. So instead of just making this a greeter app, I'll wrap that in a scaffold. I'll show you what that looks like. I'm going to make a scaffold. And one of its parameters here is the body, which will be our main application. And if we wanted to put in other things like floating action buttons here, we can certainly do that. There's a warning here because this also can be const. So again, to stay in line with the Flutter recommendations, we'll make it const. And now Control S to save. Great. Here's our message, which interestingly has now changed how it renders because it's part of a material application. And this is a text field. Well, I hope that's helpful for you for getting started with test-driven development within Dart and Flutter. Happy programming!